Okay, great. Okay, so what is a National Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform? So it's about why are we calling for this? And we do get this question, not as much as we used to, but why can't you just do it? Just do it. Somebody should just do it. Just make them do it, right? But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, and that's why we're pushing for this positive next step. So a citizens assembly is a group of citizens that's formed to deliberate on an important policy issue. And it's really based on the belief that when you bring people together, you give them the time, you give them the knowledge, you give them access to experts, and sit them down in a room together to talk to each other, share their lived experience, that they can actually find solutions to some really complicated problems. So a citizens assembly is like a mini public. So unlike a town hall, if an MP holds town hall on electoral reform, well, they'll get a good turnout and a lot of enthusiastic people, but it's a self-selected kind of exercise. It's people that already know and care a lot about this that show up to that, which is great. But a citizens assembly is selected like a jury. So with care taken to make sure that there are adequate representation of Indigenous people, different genders, different education levels. It can even be representative of political beliefs. It's basically like a microcosm of society sitting in the room. Once they're on the assemblies can take quite a long time if it's a major issue like this. It could take a year. They will learn from experts. They'll have Canada and world experts at their disposal. They will consult people in their own ridings and online. They'll hear from stakeholder groups, including Fair Vote Canada, but also groups that are in the opponent camp and all kinds of groups. They will discuss the evidence carefully and they will deliberate. And they usually come to a consensus recommendation. It doesn't mean every single person on the assembly agrees, but it's usually, in the realm of 90, 98% kind of thing. Will come to something that everybody thinks is a good idea for voters. So who commissions an assembly? Well, the government obviously commissions it because they are the ones that have the money to do this. So, it does require an investment of money, the price of a cup of coffee for every Canadian, if you want to think of it like that. But it's actually run by an independent group that only does deliberative processes. They don't care about electoral reform or any other issue. Their expertise is in running these kind of processes on any kind of issue. And that's what makes it independent and nonpartisan. And in Canada, the company that does most citizens assembly processes or similarly structured groups is called Mass LBP. And you can feel free to look them up anytime. And they have done some at the federal level. They actually did a small one a few years ago on pharmacare. They've done one on energy, and they've done one on democratic expression. The role of the government really in a National Citizens Assembly and electoral reform is to let people know what's happening. So if you have, say, 100, 200, 300 people who spend a year together in a room learning about this on behalf of all of us, and nobody knows it's happening, first of all, it's mostly useless. Second of all, you end up with 200 ticked off people because they feel like they've been thrown under the bus by the government. And we've been there before, we really have. So the role of the government is not so much to explain the minute and arcane details of electoral systems to 35 million people. It's to make sure that Canadians know that this process is happening. It's citizens just like them that are doing it to make democracy better. And that comes back to the trust issue, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So a few years ago, the OECD, there's been so many of these assemblies now around the world. They've really just exploded all over the world in the last decade, even though this model has been around since the 70s. They did a big study of 279 of them, and they developed a bunch of best practices. So what they found, what the OECD study found was that with citizens' assemblies, you get better policy outcomes from informed citizen deliberation rather than public opinion. So this is the difference between having people who really have time to learn about this compared to, say, someone in a referendum campaign that saw a 30-second attack ad from an opponent group like 50 times on their YouTube channel and now thinks that that bad thing could happen, right? So it's informed citizen deliberation. It gives greater legitimacy to make hard choices. So when you do have politicians that are willing to move forward, that want to move forward, but need that extra backup, the Citizens Assembly can provide that legitimacy. It can enhance public trust by giving citizens a role in decision-making that they wouldn't generally have. It makes decision-making in like a role, and it opens to a more diverse group of people. So the kind of people that wouldn't generally show up at maybe at a town hall or something like that. The Citizens Assembly will have folks from all walks of life on it. And it ensures that people with money, power, political influence can't have an undue influence on that recommendation. And here's just a few examples of some citizens' assemblies around the world. Ireland has almost institutionalized them, and now all the parties are quite enthusiastic about them compared to quite skeptical 10 years ago. Scotland's had some on a national level. France has had numerous on a national level, and in some places they've even been institutionalized to the point of being a permanent sort of complementary body to the legislature. So when do you want to hold one of these? Because you don't want to hold a citizens' assembly on every single issue. It really is better suited for some kinds of issues. And the OECD says value-driven dilemmas, complex problems that require trade-offs. How many times have we heard trade-offs when it comes to electoral reform? And long-term issues that go beyond short-term political incentives of electoral cycles. And in December 2022, we had ECOS run a poll for us, and this is the third such poll we've done. We have had Leger do one, we've had Angus Reid do one, and these are companies where they're not going to run it unless it's a decent, fair question. And we get the same results time and time again, which is strong support from voters in every party and across the country for this idea of a national citizens assembly. So we're going to be, Jenica and Mike and Daniel are going to be talking about this, so I'm not going to talk about it much. There are 3 opportunities coming up to advance the conversation on electoral reform. The first is a resolution that's going to the Liberal Party convention for a national citizens assembly on electoral reform. So on May 5th, I was just kidding around with the MPs before this started about, CPAC isn't exactly, primetime TV. I will be watching CPAC, hoping to see more than 50% of hands go up for this wonderful resolution at the convention. Mike Morrice is sponsoring a private members bill for the same thing, a citizens assembly and electoral reform. We can only have 20 joint seconders, and he is almost there. And we've got good support from at least 3 of the different parties so far, and even 1 conservative. And back in 2021, Daniel Blaikie won a vote for us at the PROC committee, the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. And this is the next concrete way that we can move this forward in the House of Commons. So this will be coming back to the PROC committee, hopefully this year, and you'll learn more about that from Daniel. And that is it for my screen sharing. Okay. So I'm going to start tonight with Mike Morrice. I'm going to read a short bio, which I grabbed right off of his website. So Mike Morrice is a member of Parliament for Kitchener Centre, elected in 2021. He is the founder of Sustainable Waterloo Region, co-creation of the Climate Action Waterloo Region, piloted Canada's first green economy hub. Oh, lots of things about the environment here in his leadership. So he is an active community volunteer. He's on multiple boards. Mike believes in using his platform to amplify the concerns of his community. This includes his commitment to science-based action on climate, racial justice, completing the country's social safety net through programs like a guaranteed livable income, and to electoral reform right on the website. Gotta like that, Mike. Mike is inspired by the great things people can accomplish when we listen to one another, find common ground, and prioritize future generations. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike to give us 5 minutes max of why this matters to him and how we can advance the conversation.
Thanks so much, Anita. I'll be brief. I see there's already 21 questions in the Q&A, and so I'll just say a few brief things. First of all, almost 600 people are with us tonight. I think that helps to demonstrate the deep interest across the country from coast to coast to coast in making progress here, as well as the organizing of Fair Vote Canada and Fair Vote volunteers across the country. So many of the MPs who have signed on to this motion have shared with me that a big part of why they did so is because they met with volunteers in their community who shared with them what a priority this is. And that's how our democracy is supposed to work, that we have elected people responding to the interests of their constituents. And it's thanks to Fair Vote for providing this opportunity for MPs to directly say, okay, if I'm supporting this, here's what it looks like for me to do so. Also really nice to see so many people from across the Haldeman tract with us tonight, including from Block 2 in Kitchener. A lot of the people that I feel that I am responsible to and accountable to, and that really affirms my interest in continuing this conversation. So for me, this is pretty simple. It is one of the top priorities I hear every day in my community. And when I'm at events and talking about different priorities, it's when I talk about proportional representation and electoral reform that I feel kind of the most deeply affirmed, that so many people, we saw it in the chat this evening, who are so disappointed that in Ontario, for example, that the way we currently elect people leads us towards only 18% of the voting population voting for a party that has then 100% of the power. That obviously doesn't make sense. It's obvious that every vote should count. And we know that when we move towards electoral reform and proportional representation specifically, that we end up with more collaborative, more diverse, and more responsive electorates. And so I think I'll pause it there. I am just really appreciative for the number of MPs who have, before I was ever elected, Daniel Blaikie with us tonight, for example, who's been leading on this issue for so long. To see this many MPs from across different parties come together to amplify, a really meaningful moment when the Liberal Party of Canada has a motion on the floor of their convention. I'm really encouraged to see that. But again, I think it comes down to the grassroots activism of organizations like Fair Vote and volunteers across the country who've been reaching out. And so for those of you who have, my thanks for the conversations that you've had with your MPs, for the emails that have been sent in. We do have 4 spots left, so up to 20 people can joint second a motion. We have 16 joint seconds right now from across 4 different parties. And if you don't see your MP represented there already, encourage you to continue to reach out, to ask for a conversation, because I think that's where we're seeing a lot of this response come from. So thanks again to all you who've made those, who've put those emails in and had those conversations. And I think you've seen the results in terms of the number of people who've stepped up, who previously had supported. But you'll see many names in that list that are folks that are stepping up for the first time in a very public way to demonstrate their support. And so I really, really appreciate so many Fair Vote volunteers who've put that work in. And so thank you again, and I'll pause there. I do have to leave. I apologize. I've got a chance to keep advocating for the Canada Disability Benefit on the floor of the House, and I can't pass that up. So I'll have to be stepping away around 7:15, and I'll jump back if you all are still here right after that. But yeah, keen to get into the questions. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Mike. And so we'll be here until 7:30 Eastern. All right, thank you. So I'm going to move over to Jenica. So Jenica, I've taken your bio right off your website. Jenica Atwin is passionate about people, having spent her career at the intersection of youth education and local First Nations communities. She's an advocate for and within the education system around youth and mental health, recreation, and culturally responsive education. Jenica grew up around, I don't know how to say this, Oromocto in Fredericton. She completed her master's degree in education at UNB while working full-time at Fredericton High School. It was during this time she and her husband had their 2 boys. Jenica was elected as the federal member of parliament in October 21st, 2019, became the first woman to hold this title. She is passionate about confronting the challenges we face, including climate change, rampant poverty, mental illness and addictions, and the need for reconciliation with First Nations. Jenica.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm also so excited just to see so many people who have come out to have this conversation. And anytime I'm out knocking on doors and this issue comes up, that's what I tell my constituents is keep talking about it, keep it on the radar, keep it as a priority for you, and tell your friends, get them to do the same things, because that's how we move things forward. And so really, why this is important to me, it's because it's important to Fredericton. It's important to my amazing, incredible riding, the best one in Canada. Sorry for everyone out there, but because I mean, this really, it came on my radar in 2018 when I first ran in a provincial election, I was a Green Party of New Brunswick member at that time. And when I was first kind of informed about the failures of our system, that's where it started my passion. And so, and again, listening to my other community members who are also extremely passionate about this, and in which systems they preferred, and just having those kind of intimate, kind of heated debates, it really lit this fire to say that we are, democracy in Canada is so important to who we are, but we need a democracy that works for everyone. And we need a democracy where every vote counts. And that's what I heard again and again. I still hear it knocking on doors. And so for me, it's also about, hoping that the electorate remains hopeful and engaged, and grounded in their agency. Because that's the message I'm always trying to convey, is that your voice does matter. We do listen. We are here on your behalf. My voters are my bosses. That's who I am accountable to. And so that to me is I have to keep this up because I made that promise to them. And so that's really what this is about. And it's about also keeping that hopefulness, like I said, because at a time when we're losing faith in our institutions, at a time when representation in the government isn't all that we want it to be, and I also see the low voter turnout. That's very concerning to me. I supported the NDP private members bill to lower the vote to 16 because it's so important to ingrain those voting habits, but also that agency piece, again, to have youth realize how important that is, how important that system is, that action is. And so that's really what I'm here to talk about tonight, is just to bring that all together. And a citizens assembly is a great way to do that. It's democracy in action. And I think everyone can get behind that, regardless of what the final outcome is, whatever decision is made at the end of the day. That action of getting together in a room and having these important conversations about what we want our country to look like, what we want democracy to function like, so important. And so, I think it's easy to get excited about it. And I'm so excited to get to the questions as well, because it's important to see kind of the range from across the country. I'll say, as a member from New Brunswick, from a small province, it's really important to me that our Atlantic voices are also represented, proportionally in the system. So I hope that that's part of the conversation as well. And I did want to mention, obviously making the leap to become a Liberal. I'm going to get some questions about that, I'm sure, but please know these are conversations that I am having with my colleagues. I am having it with cabinet members, with the Prime Minister directly. I'm asking these questions. And one of the main questions I asked is, what happened with the committee that studied this? And really, the kind of consensus that came out of it was that Canadians weren't informed enough about what this means. So again, back to keep talking about it, keep sharing information, keep the conversation going. Because if the interest isn't there, we're not going to be able to move it with every MP in this House. But, again, on the hopeful side of things, we do have 18 members of Parliament, Liberal members, who are supporting the motion at convention. It's my first convention as a Liberal as well. So I'm starting to learn what the process looks like, how we can move that change from within. And that's really what I came here to do. So, I'm bursting with excitement, as you can tell. And I think it's just because this is what politics is all about. This is why I got involved, is to elevate the voices of the people. And we hear you. We hear all 587 of you across the country. And just thank you so much to Fair Vote Canada for all that you do.
Thank you, Jenica. Okay, I'm going to introduce Daniel. All right, Daniel. So Daniel was born and raised in Transcona, a blue-collar neighborhood of Winnipeg built around the CN shops. He continues to live in Transcona with his wife, Janelle, and two sons, Robert and Noah. An electrician by trade, Daniel earned his certification as a construction electrician after completing a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Winnipeg and a Master's of Arts degree in philosophy at Concordia University. Daniel entered politics to fight for an economy that's fair for working people, sustainable for the planet. He brings to the House of Commons his experience working as a minister's assistant, as well as his history as a proud member of the IBEW and active member of the labor movement. First elected as the MP for Elmwood Transcona in 2015, Daniel has served in a number of positions, including NDP caucus chair, currently occupies several roles, including finance critic for employment, workforce development, and democratic reform critic. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Right on. Well, thank you very much, Anita, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It is indeed very exciting to see so many people turning out for a conversation about voting reform. And, I mean, I think for folks that are on the call, you already know many of the reasons why Canada should adopt a different voting system. And so I'm going to talk from the point of view of somebody who's an advocate for a mixed member proportional system. I think first of all, it makes sense to have the proportion of seats allocated to political parties based on the proportion of vote that they receive in the election. That's a general principle that I endorse. But I also think it's important to note that in terms of research, we still have a pretty unrepresentative parliament when it comes to the representation of women, when it comes to the representation of various other cultural groups that live in and are important to the fabric of Canadian society, and they're structurally underrepresented. And we know that in places with proportional representation, while it's not perfect, it's measurably better. And so you get better outcomes in respect of representativeness when you have more proportional systems. I also think that in the Canadian context, and I think Jenica was signaling this a little bit, one of the perversions of first past the post in a country like Canada that's so large and so regional is that we have entire political parties and political voices that are shut out of entire regions of the country. Now that's problematic in and of itself, because I think contrary to what some opponents of proportional representation say, I actually think the first past the post system is creating quite an unhealthy amount of regionalism, antagonistic regionalism in Canadian politics. One of the ways that manifests is because it means that in national caucuses, you have entire regions of the country that are missing, even though those political parties did have support in that region and really ought to have voices from all the regions at their national caucus tables. And so I think that's another and perhaps slightly more unique reason why some form of proportional representation makes so much sense in Canada. Now, in terms of Parliament, we had 2015 was a watershed moment. I think a lot of people felt it would be anyway in terms of voting system reform, and it turned into a massive disappointment. Along the way, there were some high watermarks. I mean, for me, as a new MP, proposing the structure of a proportional committee and having Nathan Cullen, who at that time was our Democratic Reform critic, take that up and be able to force a majority government into adopting that model, partly because what they had proposed was really panned by just about everyone, and they needed a way forward that made some sense. But nevertheless, I think it created a really exciting conversation around electoral reform, and the collapse of the conversation that I think with hindsight we can say that the Liberal government was hoping for, that opposition parties would fight and there wouldn't be any upshot of the committee report, didn't come to pass, partly because I think it was such an engaging conversation, and because opposition parties were able to do what most Canadians say they want from their politicians, which was to do some negotiating and some compromising and to come up with a path forward that, even if it wasn't anyone's perfect path, was an acceptable path to many. And, I shared the country's disappointment when the Prime Minister chose to throw that work out and I think come clean on where he was really at, which was not in favor of proportional representation. And we've seen him adopt that position quite consistently. I mean, even just, I can't remember if it was last fall or if it was 18 months ago now, he was interviewed and, went out of his way to slag the idea of proportional representation. And I know that in the context of this Parliament, where we've chosen not to cause an election to make progress on a number of priority areas, that was a non-starter for this government. That was something that we raised. It was something that we would be happy to move ahead with. And it's something that this government does not want to move ahead with. And so I think the question then becomes, in that context, where that you have a Prime Minister who's dead set against changing the voting system towards a more proportional system, how you keep that conversation alive and how you keep pushing. So there's a couple things. Anita mentioned in the last Parliament, I brought a motion to Proc, which passed, as some of us suspected, but we now know at the 11th hour in that Parliament, and is something that we'd like to see taken back up. a lot of things going on in the last little while, including an Ontario election and now the Liberal convention that Fair Vote, I think, has rightly been focusing a lot of energy on, which means trying to move that forward at Proc wasn't the right moment, because we want to work hand in hand with Fair Vote, who I think does a very good job advocating on this issue and bringing people together, as they have tonight and many other times. And then, of course, Mike has a motion now as well for the floor of the House, which I think is another great way to keep the conversation going, because this conversation has to continue and it has to persist. It has to be there waiting and ready for the moment where we have political leadership that does have the political will in order to be able to move forward in a meaningful way on voting reform. And so happy to be trying to find a path at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to be supporting Mike's work and to be looking for other ways that we can improve Canadian democracy in the meantime. So I just introduced a motion on the Confidence Convention, which has everything to do with, when elections happen, the power of prorogation, which has often been abused by 21st century prime ministers. And that's something that I'm looking forward to working with folks who care a lot about our democratic system and some of the fundamental components, in order to be able to try and curtail the power of a prime minister to dissolve parliament at will, or to prorogue parliament at will, in order to avoid accountability. Minority parliaments, I think, have been really good for accountability and having parliament play its traditional role. I think the Supply and Confidence Agreement, while imperfect, and I think disappointingly not including something on voting reform, nevertheless is an important thing for the voting reform movement, because it's showing that a lot of the claims about minority parliaments and how we need to have a first past the post system to have strong majorities simply aren't true. This parliament and the last parliament, I would argue, have done more for Canadians than many parliaments for decades, actually. And we've done that in the context of a minority parliament. And I think that should give hope to those of us who want to see a fairer voting system that is likely to produce more minority parliaments. I think we're showing that not only can that be functional, not only can it work at a baseline level for Canada, but actually we can get some of the most ambitious things done for people in the context of minority parliaments.
All right, thank you, Daniel. You covered a lot of ground in there. So I've been trying not to comment, not to use up precious time from our MPs, and Mike is just gone to give his speech, and he will hopefully be back in 10 minutes. But I just wanted to underscore what Daniel and Jenica and Mike are saying. We're about talking to your MP and making sure that they hear from you that this is important to you. I also want to underscore that the things that they are doing now make that so much easier. It's like an interplay between leadership by MPs to provide opportunities, like Mike and Daniel and and Jenica, those in the Liberal Party advancing the motion, have provided a concrete opportunity, which gives people a reason to go talk to their MP, which gives MPs a reason to talk to other MPs. Because I got to tell you, a lot of the MPs I had no idea supported electoral reform at this point. Maybe they wouldn't have before, but they do now. And they had no idea that other MPs supported it. So to just go and talk to them in general doesn't always produce something, but just go and talk to them and ask them to do whatever opportunity you guys are providing. It's really, really helpful. Okay, so I want to get into some of the questions here. So I've got, what arguments have you found that would persuade opponents? And there's a similar question in here that's more specifically for Jenica. How do we persuade more Liberal MPs to get on board?
Great. Well, so I guess the first part of that question, it goes to research. There have been studies conducted that show, that consensual democracies, when compared to the winner take all or the first past the post system, there's indicators of success. There's measures of success. So, you don't have to take it from me. You can go find these studies as well. But I mean, there's things that we should all agree with. Quality and independence of the public service, excellent. Quality of policymaking, the rule of law, voter turnout higher than 7.5% in most cases. Government policies most closer to the median voter. So it's less division, right? It's more people on board with the same ideas, more people feeling like they're part of that process. So it goes back to that agency piece that I'm talking about. And I've got pages here, I could list for these benefits that we would see, that I really think would return that faith in our institutions. It would help people feel that we can be proud of our democracy. And so the way to convince more Liberal MPs of that is for me to go do some of that myself, to have those conversations, of course, taps on the shoulder, sharing this research, letting them know the work that I'm doing. But again, it's a lot on the citizenship, on the voters, because I'll tell you, letter campaigns are incredibly effective. When we have caucus meetings, he'll say, how many other people received 1,000 letters on this issue? We've got to do something about this, and so it really, really works. And I'm doing that too, but I'm also surprised to see some of the names that were supporting the motion at the Liberal convention. So, the work that you do is also important, because it makes other people act as well, and so that they make their position known. And that makes it more helpful for me, because I know I can go have these kind of friendly conversations and say, who do we need to go, tap on the shoulder next? And so, I have a lot of hope and optimism. And I mean, perhaps sometimes it's, that's my downfall, but I have to believe in good, or else, why try? And so I think that the more that people do know about it, because many of the folks who are still around are not necessarily part of that 2015 cohort that were, behind the platform commitment. So it's about reminding them that this was something that, that the electorate was behind, the Liberal voters were behind. And we also know Greens, NDP. So there's incredible consensus, I think, across the country. And you showed some amazing, survey results from voters of all stripes. I was quite surprised by the Conservative voters, to be honest. And so this is something we need all parties to really get on board with. And I think the conversation itself about how do we strengthen our democracy? How do we increase voter turnout? How do we increase satisfaction in voters? That's what I want people to be happy. And we're at a time where it just really doesn't feel that way. And so, and I have my colleagues feel that too. They feel that same pressure. They want to make their voters happy. They want to see Canadians, excited with the direction that their government is going. And so it's just continuing to tell those stories and have those conversations, for sure. But I need you all to send letters and to get them to sign up too.
Okay, Daniel, do you have a comment on how to convince people who are maybe either opposed or on the fence?
Sure. Well, I'll give you 3 quick thoughts. There's a lot of great arguments, and Jenica covered a number of them very efficiently there. And so I won't review that territory, but I think in this moment, there are a few interesting arguments that one can make. First of all, to conservatives, whether they're conservative MPs or conservative party members or conservative voters, I mean, they've now had, I think, a couple in a row of elections where they've won the popular vote. And they're not the government, and they don't have anywhere near the most seats in the House of Commons. And that is an argument that resonates for them. Awkwardly, it resonates in an awkward way, but it does resonate. And it's an opportunity when they express outrage at that to say, hey, you actually know why it is that you can get so few seats with the most vote in the whole country? That's a function of the voting system that conservatives have traditionally lined up behind. And that's not going to get everyone, but certainly after the last election, and particularly in the context of the leadership vacuum that they were experiencing post-election, there were more conservatives open to that argument than I had ever seen before. Maybe not publicly, but privately, there were some musings about that. And so I think that is, it's important to constantly remind them of that as part of the long-term work to shake their faith in the first past the post system. The second is that I think it's also worth pointing out that in the 23 years of this century, we've had, I think now, 5 minority governments, and so minority governments are actually the rule in Canadian politics in the 21st century. They're not the exception. We've had more minority governments than we've had majority governments. So why do we continue to have a voting system that's predicated upon majority governments? If we're going to have minority governments anyway, shouldn't we have a system that's better tailored to minorities and trying to have more effective minority parliaments, more representative minority parliaments? I think that's an argument for the moment anyway, and I think one that's likely to stick, because when you look at voting intention, it seems like Canadians are still pretty committed to electing minority parliaments in the way that the vote separates. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, but I think it would be a better thing if we had a voting system that actually tried to do that well, instead of tried to get around having minority parliaments at all. And finally, I would say, and this is a related point, like I think, as I said earlier, minority parliaments are actually much better for accountability. So to the extent that Canadians want to see their parliament hold the government to account in a good way, minority parliaments function better for that, because the government, the executive, can't just browbeat its backbench into supporting them no matter what they're doing. There's a lot of other people that aren't accountable to the leadership of the party that's running the country, who ultimately, if they can find a way to work together, and often can say no and can get around that kind of broken majority whip culture. And so if we think that's a good thing, that Parliament really acts as a place of political accountability, then we should have a system that encourages that instead of discouraging it. And there's lots of good 21st century examples of how that can work well for Canadians. So I think those are kind of the arguments that I'm keeping in my quiver these days, because I think they do get a positive response. And I think, this is not a surprise. Political cultures develop over time, but I think over the last 20 years, the political culture has been developing in a way that helps those arguments resonate more. And I think that's a good thing from where we were at 20 years ago, even though we haven't arrived yet. We'll be done when we actually change the voting system. And I'm really excited to one day cast a ballot that may even have the option, of local candidate names on the ballot and a party, and that one might be able to vote for a local candidate that they like and a political party that they want to see represented, even though they don't want the local candidate or they don't think they have a chance of winning. I think that would be really exciting to give Canadians more options to express their political intention, which of course is very rarely perfectly aligned monolithically with any one political party.
Yeah. I just want to back up what Daniel's saying. We're hearing a lot in the news these days about how cooperation is great. Isn't it great they're cooperating? They write whole articles about how two parties are having a meeting. Like, that to me shows how much the culture has changed even just in the last year, when it's like not like cooperation by temporary inconvenience that's going to fall apart any day, which was like the story before. Now it's like, wow, they're talking all the time. This government could even last till 2024 or 2025, and they're getting things done. And it's seeing is believing, folks, And so we talk about other countries, but we're seeing just a little taste of what that kind of cooperation could look like when nobody can win a majority with 35% of the vote. And it will change the culture, and we're just starting to see that a little bit now. I wanted to ask the question that everybody asks, and it's a tough question. Nobody has a perfect answer to this, but let's say we have a citizens' assembly. Why would the government listen to it? I get this question from understandably cynical people all the time. So it really ends up being a similar question to what you've already answered. But how can we increase the chances that if we get a citizens' assembly, the government will act?
Although I see Mike is back. Hey, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Well, I mean, the first piece, I guess, is the convention piece, because if this is driven from within the inside party politics, it can appear on the platform, and then it could be a commitment the government makes to fund. And if they're funding this, then I think that it would be prudent to then listen to the outcome of that funded gathering or citizens' assembly. And so, I mean, you've got to get a supportive leadership team, who are behind this. And the way to do that, again, is to get the voters, those who are Liberal members, to put forward that piece at the convention. So my hopes are very high for this, my first convention experience. And so we shall see. I will learn a lot from this experience. But if the support is there, the membership drives what the policy platforms look like. And then again, therefore, if it's passed and it's something that they commit to funding, then they better listen to what the outcome is.
It's a good answer, Jenica. When they're more invested in it themselves, then we have a better chance of seeing it succeed. Daniel or Mike? Mike, did you catch the question?
Yeah, I think so. And apologies again for having to step away. I think this just reinforces what great timing this conversation is. So my understanding is the convention's May 5th, correct?
Yep.
And we're recording this on April 24th. So that's the window of time that, particularly for those of you from across the country who live in a riding represented by a Liberal MP, where they're going to have the good fortune of having a chance to vote on a citizens' assembly on May 5th. And that makes it really clear for them where they stand, thanks to the Liberal members for Vancouver Quadra, I believe the EDA is. And so, thanks to those members in that particular riding and to Fair Vote for putting a spotlight on this, again, I think the number of people tonight just shows that we're all looking for a moment to build the support for something that we all know should have happened years ago and that we know is going to improve our democracy for the better. And so I have had several folks who have joint seconded who have told me that there maybe have been a bit on the fence or had a question or two, but it was from that conversation with people in their community that as should be the case, that an open-minded MP who should be listening to their constituents, that's going to shift as a result of those conversations. And so we've got several weeks here for those conversations still to happen. And so if you don't live in a riding represented by a Liberal MP, consider reaching out to a friend who does. This is a really critical window to help to shift how those votes are going to go at that particular convention, and use that as a place to build momentum, to make it really clear that someone can't just slippery say, I believe in the idea. Well, there's a very concrete proposal on the table here. And in the meantime, there's also 4 more spots to joint second if it's an NDP or someone else. So to me, that there's just, Fair Vote's given many different options for us to make the most of this moment. And to me, that's how our democracy at its best is supposed to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in many ways, this is the most important question, and it is the most challenging. And there's no shortage of disappointments that you can point to from examples across the country of governments that committed in one way or another to move ahead on voting reform. Some cases even had the citizens' assemblies, right, and then didn't act on it, usually using a referendum as a way to kind of get out of acting. Of course, the first one, to my knowledge, I could be wrong, I'm sure folks in the chat will correct me if I am, was in BC, where they required a supermajority and actually got the number that they needed on a simple majority to be able to move ahead. And I think that was certainly for me, who, like when I was just starting out in my university career, I helped found a Fair Vote chapter in Winnipeg. And that experience for me in BC, and my thinking has changed on this a few times over the years. For me, the initial BC experience, the lesson that I took away from that was that citizens' assemblies wouldn't work because you didn't have people in the political system championing the outcome, right? And so I got, in my kind of voting reform activism, after that, I got more involved with the NDP. I thought the way to do it was to have a well-defined proposal and people that would take political accountability for that. After the debacle with the special committee and such a clear intention from Justin Trudeau to change the voting system, and then throwing out the work that people who, as I had imagined, would be politically accountable for their work, first in the committee and then, in the Prime Minister for his promise in the election, and then kind of watch that all fall apart, I really appreciated why people are skeptical of politicians leading that process, no matter what they profess at election time. And so my thinking has shifted again, and I feel like a citizens' assembly has an important role to play, if for nothing else. And I don't think this is the only thing that a citizens' assembly would accomplish, but perhaps the most important thing is to build trust with people who rightly have a distrust of politicians who do have an interest in the system the way it is. And so I've kind of come back to citizens' assemblies because it was such a disillusioning experience to have someone so clearly run on changing the voting system and so clearly not exclude proportional representation from that. And then when there was a path that included proportional representation, retroactively slammed the door. I thought, okay, well, I don't know how people are going to trust politicians on this stuff again, which is a real drag for a politician who cares a lot about voting reform and has tried in good faith to do a lot of work on that file, because it means people have less faith in me, and my earnestness has nothing to do with it. I can be as earnest as I like. Those precedents of people feeling betrayed by other politicians matter. And, people aren't irrational for thinking that other politicians would do the same, even if it's not true. And so that's how I've kind of come back to citizens' assemblies. But how do you tie the government to the outcome of a citizens' assembly? I haven't answered that question. I realize that. I'm not sure how to answer that. I thought I had an answer, which was that political actors should say which voting system they endorse, and they should run on that. They should form a government, and they should do it. And I've seen the problems with that way of thinking now too. Although Justin Trudeau never did say what voting system he really endorsed. And in fact, I think he did endorse one. And that was part of the problem, was there wasn't enough kind of upfront honesty about what he really meant by voting reform, and 2015 being the last election. But I'm digressing on that point somewhat. I'll get away from that, but I hope it's useful for folks that are listening to see the kind of progression of one voting reform activist thinking, and somebody who's been very involved in political life, obviously, as well. So
it definitely is, Daniel, and it gives people a little insight into the fact that Fair Vote's been around for 21 years now, and there's no magic answer. There's no one key, one strategy. This is it. This is the answer. Our thinking evolves. We learn as we go. And there's a reason why we're pushing Citizens Assembly for the last 4 years. But I wanted to try to answer that, because so many people who want it now, and trust me, that's me too, but why can't we make it binding? Well, we can't make it binding because we have a representative democracy, and the politicians would have to make it binding, and they're not going to bind themselves to something they haven't even seen. So I just want to underscore that for me, where I've come to, we will not get PR until we have multi-party agreement. And that's how it's happened, not by referendum. Across the OECD, PR happens when parties make an agreement. It doesn't mean every single party is ever going to agree. That's never going to happen. That's unicorn territory. But when multiple parties can come to a compromise, then the voting system changes. So how do we get to that? And a citizens' assembly is one piece. It's not the end of the discussion. It's not, we have the assembly and then bam, they better do that thing right now or they're bad. It's something to feed into the conversation and hopefully make it easier for politicians to move forward with that and to have that negotiation that we didn't get in 2015. We didn't get a chance to have that negotiation because nobody was willing to discuss anything for reasons Daniel's outlined. But that doesn't mean we won't have another kick at the can, and that is how other countries have done it, through multi-party agreement. And we will get there if we keep pushing and keep strengthening our movement. And I just want to touch on what Jenica said about the convention resolution. There have been the 3 times that proportional representation got on the federal agenda in Canada were after these resolutions passed. 1919, 2014, and let's make it 2023. But even if we don't make it 2023, we've built an incredible amount of support just in the last year. I think we're making significant progress. Okay, so let me see if there's other questions that people had. I'm just going to take a quick look because I got myself a little bit distracted. There was one question that I also get asked a lot, and it's only somewhat related to this. How can we make MPs listen to their constituents rather than their party? And I think this somewhat ties into our topic. Would any of you like to? Oh, there's hands going up. Okay, Mike, I'll let you go first because you were away for a bit.
Well, maybe just briefly to say, we support them when they stand up. And so I think Jenica, for example, tonight, it takes some bravery and courage to be the voice, recognizing that not everyone in the Liberal Party feels that same way. And I think, when we see the research from the Samara Institute, 99 point whatever % of MPs vote along party lines. While we can't remove ourselves from that we are part of the democracy that we see play out in the House of Commons every day. And that means you've got a choice. Are you going to, shame those that don't support, or are you going to focus on celebrating those who do? And, we've got a good number of the 16, a good number of Liberal MPs who are each kind of putting themselves out there a little bit to vocalize their support in advance of this motion. And I think if we choose to celebrate those who are taking these kinds of courageous steps, it gives us a better chance of someone else saying, you know what, I want to be like her, and I'm going to do the same thing that she's doing. And I think that's the kind of ripple effect that Anita and the rest of the Fair Vote team are giving us an opportunity here for. And so, Jenica, I saw you had your hand up, but I think it's really, it says a lot with having you here tonight to be speaking to this, and I appreciate you for it.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate all that you do always. And I mean, I saw a comment too about, if Jenica isn't successful, pushing this with her party, she'll just jump to another one. Like, there's this is not helpful. And I think the reason is because I hope that people see what I'm trying to do. It is try to drive change from within. And I'm doing what I can. And the reason I do that is because that's what my voters and my community and my riding sent me here to do. And on the whipped voting system about having, the voice of your constituents versus the party. I try to be as nonpartisan as possible. I try to be as Fredericton community oriented as possible. That's what I came here to do. I know that whenever this journey is over, I need to go back home and live in my community and be able to look my constituents and my community members in the eye. And I just have to say, there's conversation about what happens behind the scenes, even in big machines like the Liberal Party. I've proven it time and time again that I vote the way that my constituents want me to vote. There's a 24-hour rule in our party that, if there's something comes up and you're not in line with how the government wants you to vote, you just have to let them know. And my rationale is always, this matters to me because it matters to the people back home. And this is how I'm going to vote because they sent me here to do that. So I think part of it is telling these stories, letting people know that you can have some faith in the people that you sent here. And if you don't have faith in them, remember that the next time it's time to vote. Your vote does matter. Even in this broken system, we've managed to do some incredible things. And all I've ever known is minority governments. And I love this collaboration. I love the supply and confidence agreement with the NDP. I was cheering the day that happened. I thought, wow, look at this. This is a government. This is a parliamentary system working for people. I feel like that was a sign of good things to come. The dental care is a huge, piece of that I'm so excited to go back home and talk about. Those are examples of when we can get wins, and we have to have faith in each other to get those wins. And so really, I that's the message I always try to bring back home. That's the message I bring to youth when I go talk to schools. It's, it's not a game. This is real life, and we're here to do real things. And we need you to have that same faith in us to do those things and hold our feet to the fire and make us accountable. And that's the way we make change.
Daniel, do you have a comment before we close off?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just circle back to what Mike was saying. I thought he put it well. If we want to see members of political parties, defy their party, although I'll say sometimes people defy their party and then and then people don't like that if they agree with the position of the party, and so it's certainly a double-edged sword. But I think Mike is quite right that you have to create, and this is not something that's just on MPs. In fact, it may be even less on them than anyone else, to create a culture where that's accepted, where it's not the end of the world, where an MP who votes against the party isn't calling into question the leadership and wants to throw out the leader and doesn't agree anymore, or is going to cross the floor, all the doomsday scenarios that are ready to hand in the mouths of our media and many others. Whenever there is disagreement. And we can look to other Westminster parliamentary democracies where there is more of a culture of backbench MPs not supporting their government or asking very difficult questions of their government. It is not the case in Canada that we have that kind of culture. And I think that's regrettable, but I don't think it's because Canadian MPs are somehow, inherently spineless and UK MPs have a lot of grit. I think it's because there's a culture that's developed over time. And in Canada, we're not actually very tolerant with MPs who disagree with their party. And so I think, that is a culture we have to build. And I think Mike is talking about building it in the right way. It's building it through a kind of positivity, not even necessarily agreeing with the position that an MP who's disagreeing with their party might be, but to recognize the legitimacy of MPs doing that, and then to evaluate their position on its merits. And I haven't seen a lot of effective examples of that in Canadian politics, so that's part of it. And then I would remind folks as well that even where, I've mostly voted with the NDP, I've been very happy to do that. I agree with most of the positions of the NDP. I've voted against the whip a couple times in my parliamentary career, they're definitely the exception, not the rule. But part of that also is that, you know, caucuses have, I'll speak for the NDP caucus anyway. I mean, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of debate and a lot of challenging of points of view within caucus. And to have a sense of solidarity and that you're working together as part of a movement and a team, there has to be give and take. So if I go into the NDP caucus room and I say, well, I need to win every argument or I'm just going to vote against you guys all the time, it's very hard to be cohesive as a group. And we see that not just with political parties, but also political movements for various issues, where if there isn't enough common ground, there's a splintering, and then you can't be effective as a political movement. So, you know, I think it's important also to bear that in mind, and that is going on as behind the scenes and as part of the process as well. It's not just that MPs get a missive on the day of the vote, and there hasn't been any conversation or any work that's gone into figuring out what the party position is going to be, or that those MPs haven't been a meaningful part of those discussions. So a little context, but mostly I do think we should have a culture where MPs feel more empowered and where they're taking a different position is better received, and where the doomsday scenarios don't suddenly burst forth in the media and elsewhere.
Mike, did you have something you wanted to add? I thought I saw your hand go up for a sec.
It's just a thumbs up to Blaikie. Because I think that's, yeah, it is part of that culture that the media will write a story to say, oh my gosh, this person doesn't agree. And to me, that's democracy. When someone is doing that, they're saying, hey, my community and my constituents are the most important thing to me, more than my political party. They're putting democracy ahead of politics. That person should be celebrated, not derided. And we can't separate ourselves from that. So I appreciate what Blaikie said there.
Okay. So we are at time. We're actually 3 minutes over time. So I want to thank the 3 MPs that have joined us tonight, and for joining us and for creating these opportunities that make it easier for us to send people to see their MPs, to give people realistic hope on a really an issue which is hard to generate that realistic hope sometimes, for giving us all that hope that the 3 of you can have this conversation, and look how many more can have this conversation too. To let you know that after Mike gets his 20 seconders on this motion, that's not going to be the end of it. We're going to provide an additional way that more MPs can publicly support. And so everyone here will see, oh, there's more than we thought. Maybe there's more than 16. Maybe there's more than 18. Maybe there's more than 50. Maybe it's time to have this conversation now that we weren't ready to have back in 2016 and 2017, because really it's the newer MPs I'm finding that are the most receptive. They don't have the baggage, and they just see, whoa, all these problems that you guys have talked about on this webinar, the polarization and people not showing up to vote, and all they want a way to address this. So we're getting a lot of positive feedback and to reinforce that. So I want to thank you, all 3 of you, for creating opportunities. Thank all the about 600 people that showed up to join us. We will share this on YouTube so there'll be more people that get to enjoy this conversation.